Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Luke Hunt and this is another podcast with The Diplomat, and with us today is a regular, Bradley Murg, who is now an Associate Fellow of the Pacific Forum, and up for discussion is the Cambodian election and, more importantly, the transfer of generational power from long-serving Prime Minister Hun Sen to his eldest son, Hun Manet. Brad, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Luke. It's a pleasure to be back.
Again, now, where to start? We've covered the elections pretty well, but to ask the obvious question, how important were the elections in terms of Hun Sen's grand design?
Well, no surprises with the outcomes, as we've all been expecting for quite a while now. I think really towards the end we saw that Hun Sen it seemed, turned out to get about 5 seats, which, although that also was not a massive surprise. Overall, one has to say it's a success for the now former Prime Minister in terms of facilitating a smooth, orderly, quiet, essentially, transition of power.
Right, now Hun Manet, he's 45, a West Point graduate. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Bristol. There's been some speculation, and there's been some noises from the government too, that they might actually look for improved relations with the United States and the West. Do you think that's likely?
We've had the background and the training, and it really is sort of what you would consider ideal as a potentially a new starting point or a way to rebuild relations, particularly with the United States, that have clearly deteriorated enormously over the last few years. So there is a push from a lot of folks to frame this as, all right, this is a new starting point and things can improve. And we're already seeing the framing of, all right, Cambodia is absolutely following a policy of neutrality, et cetera, and it wants to build new relations. I think to get into, to move beyond speculation, we need to get into some of the causation within Cambodia behind what would serve as an actual foundation for change. And I think the reality there is the recognition across large segments of the government, that the country's economy requires diversification. There can't be the same reliance on Chinese investment. And let me qualify that. When I talk about Chinese investment and Chinese funds in Cambodia, yes, China continues to fund large amounts of infrastructure projects. And we see these commitments, we saw them throughout Cambodia's ASEAN chairmanship, specifically the new highway funding from Phnom Penh to the border city of Bavet at Vietnam. At the same time, however, infrastructure investment and infrastructure lending is not the only thing. Chinese investors, as Beijing and Phnom Penh seemingly never tire of pointing out, are the largest investors in Cambodia. However, since COVID-19, the expectations, that funding, of that money, of that private money coming back, haven't been fully realized. We haven't seen the inflow of money, particularly into the real estate market. That seed is necessary. There have been certain challenges with some Cambodian exports to China. And at the same time, we also simply have not seen, over a year now, a year and a half since the kingdom has reopened, we simply haven't seen a return of Chinese tourists. China's now reopened, and it seems as though every week we'll get someone commenting or an op-ed coming out saying, oh, Chinese tourists are right around the corner. We've seen initial flights did return with the first Chinese tourists. I mean, massive ceremonies at airports, but that's all there's been.
The numbers just aren't there.
Exactly.
And one would imagine that when potential Chinese tourists read the headlines coming out of Cambodia, in particular regards to human trafficking, it's not exactly a good look when you're deciding where to spend your summer break.
The media reporting and the reality of human trafficking in Southeast Asia, and I think we have to recognize this as a Southeast Asian problem, not just a Cambodian problem. But the numbers are, and despite, and there have been strong efforts by the Ministry of the Interior to resolve some of these cases, but the estimates we see from entities and governments outside of the country are much higher, the level of severity of the scam compound issue in Cambodia. This doesn't present exactly, a wonderland vacation destination, as you know, particularly recognizing how much Sihanoukville has played into this story and how much Sihanoukville essentially it's been designed for Chinese tourists coming to gamble, etc. But you might absolutely have a second choice when you look at crime rates and you look at these other concerns that are all over the press.
And the alternatives, Macau is reopened to mainland gamblers, and that's going to be a big competitive factor for here as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
In terms of the cabinet lineup, Hun Manet, the former finance minister, is looks like moving into the number 2 spot. He's a technocrat, and I think on the finance front, many are expecting him to step up to the plate in terms of foreign investment and what's needed in this country.
I think his role, along with that of the new foreign minister, both demonstrate a very strong focus on the economy as priority one.
Right.
And when we look at the minister from the Ministry of Economics and Finance, and we see among the ministries in Cambodia really excellent, sections of really strong governance and excellent focus. And we can simply looking at Cambodia's balance sheet. Cambodia does not have the public debt problems that other countries have. It's sort of the classic case of the Chinese loan debt trap thing, which we all know was overhyped, but that this is not something that takes place here.
Right.
Or it's something that we haven't seen. Cambodia's balance sheet, well, there has been a bit of a deficit over 2023, and I think that's likely to continue into 2024, although possibly worsen depending on conditions. We have seen significant improvements in fiscal governance. We've seen significant improvements in tax collection capability. We've seen budgets that are kept where they're supposed to be. So you do have that guiding hand moving forward. That'll be quite reassuring.
But the economy is struggling, and the tax department has been sharply criticised by all quarters in Cambodia in life for being too harsh, too mean, cracking down too hard. One can understand the need to raise general revenue, but it just seems to highlight the need to attract more money and to do it fairly as well. I mean, the country has a notorious reputation for corruption, wanted or whether it's justified or not. But especially when one compares Cambodia with other countries in the region, it's not always out of step on that score. But it's perceptions matter in terms of this country.
They do, and so I think there's a few things that we can begin to unpack there. First is if we look at the development of the fiscal system, and this is not a short-term process. Cambodia's fiscal capacity up until today is remarkably different, and its capacity in that ministry is remarkably different than it was just 5 years ago. Building out that capacity is going to take time. It's not a around the corner sort of issue, but we have to recognize the improvements that have come, while also saying there's significantly more work to do. So I don't see that as a particular impediment. I think the corruption issue, and particularly Cambodia's rankings on the myriad of international metrics, looking at the World Bank rankings, looking at the Ease of Doing Business Index, the Corruption Perceptions Index. Yeah, all of these are things that are going to scare away foreign investment, and beginning to try to make a dent to that, and whether that's
it's also
possible.
a matter about attracting them back.
Yeah.
You know, we go back to 7 years ago when the exodus really started with the crackdown on the press and the opposition. The Chinese came in, and the Cambodians were more than a little like, ha to you, the West, we've got China kind of thing. And now that's sort of gone full circle. It's actually getting them back. It's not just they have left for reasons, and they're not going to come back unless they're satisfied that there's, well, at least some guarantee on their investments.
Yeah, there needs to be a wooing, and there is a wooing for the foreign business community. Not just there are obviously organizations here that represent foreign firms, and there's also engagement through with Cambodian delegations abroad. And I think we also see that, and we're going to see much more of that in Cambodian foreign policy. So if we we shift ministries and shift neighborhoods in Phnom Penh, we go over to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we look at where that direction's going. We saw indications of this a couple of years ago when the National Institute for Diplomacy and International Relations, which trains Cambodia's diplomats, really began to push much more strongly on economic and commercial diplomacy. And we've seen that in some of the placements of Cambodian ambassadors. I think the Cambodian ambassador in South Korea is an excellent example of having quite a bit of success in terms of pushing a more economic and commercial portfolio. And for a country such as Cambodia, where that really requires this diversification and needs to go to all ports to find new investment. I mean, FDI is a competition.
Right.
That having a foreign ministry that is more laser beam focused on economic and commercial issues is definitely a change. But in my view, it's very much a change for the better.
You know, speaking of ports, the elephant in the room is always going to be China is always going to be the Chinese-funded reconstruction of the Re naval base, which the Americans are claiming is China's number 2 foreign military base after Djibouti. I mean, how do you handle that? Should the Cambodians insist it's their sovereignty and it's up to them to decide? Okay, fine. Could you see the day when American ships are invited to dock at Reem?
Well, I'd rank it below. I think Gwadar and Pakistan, and together with Djibouti, are significantly more important than whatever is going on at Reem. There's an element of Reem, though, as we've seen the narrative evolve over time from this isn't being built to okay, it's being built to okay, it's being built, but it won't just be for China.
You
it'll
can
be
take
for
an
all
aircraft
ports,
carrier,
etc. So it's been evolving over time, and we haven't really seen any. It's still a problem, but I think it's a problem in the political relationship between the U.S. and Cambodia and other countries in Cambodia as well. Obviously, Vietnam, for one, that has expressed serious concerns, and I believe by Thailand as well and others. But I think that the goal of the government is going to be to keep that issue to one side while it focuses on the economic aspect. Why should these two issues be intertwined?
Right, and comes back to this foreign policy argument in that Cambodia hasn't only upset the United States and the West, it's also got its issues by acting as China's proxy inside ASEAN. In some respects, it's done a great job shepherding East Timor into the group. It's one, but its ability to scuttle any sort of agreement within ASEAN when it comes to the code of conduct in the South China Sea has proved quite remarkable over the last 10 years. And surely there must be relations in there that can do with some patching up as well.
I think we have to look at it in a few ways. So we go back to the South China Sea issue from over a decade back, the issue with the ASEAN conference when Cambodia was ASEAN chair, and the inability to reach a conclusion, and Cambodia being the holdout. Today, at the same time, I think we have to look at a changing landscape of ASEAN that's not just serious for Cambodia, but for ASEAN as a whole. The question of, previously, is Cambodia China's only voice in ASEAN? Are there others? And today, yes. I mean, we look at Myanmar, we look at, to some extent, Laos as well, as countries that will be able to put forward, and occasionally will put forward, interests that are more akin to China. So Cambodia is no longer the only game in town, as it were. In that sense, for the China role, Cambodia built a lot of goodwill during its ASEAN chairmanship. In 2022, it was carried out very, very well. Everybody's fears of South China Sea dominating the conversation didn't happen. Timor-Leste.
Well, hang on a second. That was China's fears, and perhaps
Cambodia's fears.
There are a lot of other people who wanted to see that pushed to the front of the agenda.
Absolutely, but I think we're also coming to an issue, though, on a question like South China Sea Code of Conduct, which will continue to be discussed. It will continue to be discussed. I'm of the view that it's time to move on. That it's simply not realistic. I mean, China's made clear that it won't abide by the Hague Agreement. The Hague ruling regarding the Philippines claims. Why would we expect China to abide by a code of conduct in any way? It's
my last reading of the Chinese version of the code of conduct is it basically would bind ASEAN states to an agreement whereby they would not seek outside military help, which would tear up pretty much every security agreement in the region.
The U.S. has legal, particularly with the Philippines, the U.S has, and And I mean, the Philippines being the most straightforward, where that relationship, which is a topic for a different podcast, is since Duterte left and we've had President Marcos, the enormous shift in so many pundits saying Philippines was moving towards China, which was of course laughable always as a conclusion, but now the Philippines being essentially America's best friend again,
right.
in Southeast Asia.
And Biden's made no secret of that.
And President Marcos got the photo he very much wanted on the White House lawn, and expansion of U.S. base access,
right.
In the Philippines, etc. But let's scroll back to our main topic and go back to Cambodia. So how that moves forward is a question. Anything would be really pure speculation as to whether it's going to be a permanent spanner in the works, whether this is simply a point that will long impede any improvement in relations, or whether there's alternatives. But at the same time, I think when we go back to the economic realities, that there are a lot of scary indicators out there for the Cambodian economy.
And that's globally.
Globally, we have global challenges. We're already seeing declines in factory orders and employment in the garment manufacturing sector, simply because, the largest market for that, the United States, and as is always pointed out, the U.S. is a larger importer of Cambodian goods than the next 4 or 5 partners combined. I mean, it's simply an enormous market for Cambodia. The U.S. does have a role here economically, even if it's not historically been, or more recently, been investment. But you have to sell those products to someone, and Americans happen to be the folks that buy them. So the U.S. has a role as an export destination, and even without, we recall that the GSP, the trade status, lapsed a few years ago. This wasn't directed towards Cambodia. It was simply not renewed by Congress. And in recent meetings between the Cambodian government and U.S. congressional delegations, Cambodia has pushed for this to return, although I think it's highly unlikely that Congress is going to be expanding trade preferences for anybody in the run-up to an election in a year or so. So probably not possible. But the need for diversification, the need for investment is going to become greater. And we keep seeing the concerns on the China side. I mean, hardly a day passes without more bad news out of China. And particularly in the real estate, the possibility of China going into deflation, moving. I mean, the number of moving parts in the China economic story is simply massive. But seeing, yes, that
one of the stories that surprised me was having done a lot of work here in Sihanoukville, and as we know, there's more than 1,000, 1,100 abandoned half-built skyscrapers down there. Now these stories are starting to come out of China, where you have entire cities. Well, Sihanoukville, 1,100's a lot. I mean, it's there's an argument here, like, when is the Chinese money coming back? When are we going to sort out legal issues regarding ownership of these properties? Where in China, if it's 1,100 here, it might be 300,000 buildings there.
The scale of and we are at different points. I mean, Cambodia and China. So there's some parallels between their challenges. Both operate very where China. Some of the research work done on the Chinese construction and real estate market is that in light of China's now declining population, there is simply no more demand for building these massive skyscrapers and residential complexes for whom? I mean, for a declining population. But they serve as an investment vehicle. There are very few investment vehicles in China, and there's an estimate, and the structure of how these things are built. Cambodia very much follows the Chinese model of you buy before it's built. And you wait. And historically, people saw this as a positive thing. Okay, I can get in at a low price, and it's just going to go up in value, and this is wonderful. But at the same time, as a lot of analysts have said, the model resembles something of a Ponzi scheme.
Well, they don't have the same rules as other places, say Singapore, where it's required to have 90% sales of those apartments before you start committing, before you commit to build. I.e., you have the money there under escrow and the building gets built.
Yeah,
that wasn't required.
Yeah, and that's I think what a lot of people are looking at, the problems that occurred with this in China with Evergrande and everyone else, and wondering, okay, well, is the shoe going to drop here in Cambodia, in terms of because we simply have not had the investment coming in to the condo market.
Cambodia has joined ASEAN through ASEAN, which had quite a substantial rise last year in trade. I think it was up 6%, which is in decades past that would be seen as a poor figure, but at the moment it's not bad, 33 billion. And at the same time, it's announced that it intends to leave the ranks of the least developed countries by 2027. It's up for a review by the UN in 2024. That's going to bring with it some problems.
Yeah. So when and 2027 is the year that I think most people are agreeing on. That's the year that Cambodia will finally grow out of the preference status that it gets as a less developed country and low income, although we're already at lower and middle income level. But that means certain trade preferences go. But this has been known and recognized for a while. This isn't coming as a shock to anybody in government. And that does mean that there's going to have to be some continued climbing up the ladder of production. And we do see this. We see that, and we're going to see it quite a bit soon as we get when the new government comes in, and we'll see the new economic development strategy released, how that's going to be moving forward with a lot of focus on two areas. I mean, in addition to diversification, we're also seeing a very strong focus on TVET, on essentially vocational education and training. Because one of the challenges the country confronts is human capital.
Right.
And if Cambodia recognizes, and it's taking those steps, we see that with new manufacturing, particularly down south in Bavet, and as we integrate that portion of Cambodia into Vietnamese chains of production, but there is a labor problem in terms of human capital. So, and there'll be a study coming out about that from one of the major donors later this year, a large-scale diagnostic study about Cambodia that'll be coming out later this year, which will be quite interesting to see. So industrial policy and industrial diversification of industry and moving away from low-cost garments. Some folks have said that Cambodia's already lost its comparative advantage in this sector. I don't think that's true.
Well, it was never.
But in 2020, but in a few years, right. we can't be doing textiles. It's time for we can be. It's time to move on.
But just to hold back a second. People talk about this competitive edge as if it you'll lose your edge. But one of the great reasons for Cambodia's existence as a manufacturing production centre is that it's not China, and the brands want alternative sources, and I still think this will stand Cambodia in good stead. I mean, you've got a couple 100,000 people who are trained up and know how to use these machines, who know how to make garments. I don't think they're going to just disappear.
No, we'll have. It's a question of. I mean, in Cambodia's wage rates are still, the minimum wage goes up, but it's still relatively low. But over time, this is what you want to do. You want to move out of. This is the bottom rung of the ladder of production. It's great. It employs 850,000, 900,000 people. Very large number of whom are single income, female-led households.
Yeah, from the villages.
So absolutely essential economically. But it's also a question of having to keep up and keep climbing. In my view, I think that Cambodia's enormous strength as it moves ahead is. I mean, the irony, of course, is when you talk about Cambodia in geopolitics, Cambodia always discusses the curse of its location, and we're caught here, and we're right in between, and this is the focus of China-U.S. competition. Yeah, but if we look at a more, we scan in a little bit more. Cambodia is the link between Thailand and Vietnam.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say.
That's it.
If they have those 6-lane.
Yeah.
Expressways running from the Vietnamese to the Thai border, north-south into Laos, plus railway lines, it cannot not benefit.
Yeah, and the east-west, the long discussed and planned for, and so much east-west economic corridor, that, I mean, the ideal was to go from Vietnam all the way to Myanmar. Obviously, Myanmar's out now, but being able to focus on Cambodia as a transit point and improving soft infrastructure, hard infrastructure, lowering customs clearance times, all of these sorts of things. Also together is, I mean, the real winner in the U.S.-China trade war and the real winner in U.S.-Chinese economic, depends on your view, decoupling or de-risking, depending on your politics, has been Vietnam. Right. And the great benefit for Cambodia is the fact that, yes, Cambodia is next door, has and the ability to integrate with Vietnam is not a huge challenge, but it provides a real engine and a different engine for Cambodia's growth than reliance on essentially the property sector and tourism. And because we've seen what's happened in the past with that. We saw with COVID what happened when 17% of GDP is
tourism has always been a shallow industry. The connection with Vietnam is interesting, and if you look at the ASEAN Leaders Summit coming up September 5 to 7 in Jakarta, how there has been this kind of, the way commentators are talking, it's now the Philippines and Vietnam.
Yeah.
And the Philippines and Vietnam are discussing their own military pact in terms of securing up the South China Sea that lies between them. And when the Foreign Minister for China, Wang Yi, came through, he made a point of taking in friendly countries, i.e. Singapore, Malaysia and Cambodia. Meanwhile, Biden's talking about going to Vietnam, as you said. Marcos from the Philippines has been to Washington. The schisms within ASEAN, particularly between the maritime and mainland states, seems to be widening. And Cambodia, I think, has often been seen as a spanner in the works. It comes back to this cross-border trade. Could it improve relations? And there's a smart man's game to be played in there, one would think.
I think the issues can be separated to some degree. Is the economic from the geopolitical still at this point, looking at the prioritization that all of these governments give Cambodia, Vietnam, to economic growth and economic development as a key buttress for state legitimation and state legitimacy. And Cambodia doesn't. There is a question on this, which I hope, but I'm not very optimistic. This is not an issue. The South China Sea issue is just not an issue that Cambodia has any real national interest in.
Indeed,
it is not a claimant state. It is not a border state. And I think beginning to have that discussion of, well, what is Cambodia's? How is this actually in the national interest of Cambodia to exert any effort on this? Now, obviously, it's the China question. But if China's not fulfilling its commitments, I mean, infrastructure funding is absolutely essential, and there's a huge funding gap. And China is providing those loans, even though they're not at the standard concessionary rates we'd really like to see, and they don't follow the transparency rules, and God forbid there's appropriate environmental and social impact studies of all of this. But where's the private money? And this goes back to what we were discussing earlier when we look at the Chinese economy, and folks saying, yes, it might be moving into a period of deflation. But we do see that Chinese savings, individual household savings, are strong. People simply aren't spending. They're not spending. Right. And how China directs that outward, or even if China has an interest in directing it outward in light of its own concerns domestically. It wants to, remember, China really wants to move forward with its dual circulation model, domestic demand driving the economy. But no one's quite sure how that's going to happen. So where it comes to Cambodia, again, it's just times have changed. We're not in the COVID era, and the money's not here, and that could raise some questions among a lot of folks.
How far do you think China would go in terms of pressuring Cambodia into doing its bidding?
Well, it's a question of mechanisms of well, what are the tools that China might have to act against Cambodia? But also, what signal might that send? So, I mean, Cambodia is a member of ASEAN, and Cambodia does have relations with a large number of states. Could it slow down or cut infrastructure investment? Sure. But there are other sources, obviously not nearly enough, but let's not forget that Japan, South Korea, the United States, others are significant donors as well. But for China to make an example of Cambodia doesn't really set precedent when you're trying to make nice and have and play the lovable happy panda card across the rest of the globe. I mean, Cambodia is recognized by many states as having received enormous amount of Chinese private and public funding, and is regularly trotted out as this ironclad diamond cooperation framework, more pinnacle relation than any other in the world. If you suddenly you can't turn on a dime 180 degrees and start saying that, oh well, let's punish Cambodia. It's not a great look for the rest of your global campaign. It's a bit of a problem if China decided to do that.
And on the cabinet postings, which are going through the processes of being approved, what do you think of this whole concept of passing portfolios, in that CPP has ruled here since 1979 when the Vietnamese left. Hun Sen since the mid-80s. His cabinet, the ministers, have been around him for 40 years, and now they're all going to pass their portfolios to their children, mostly to their sons.
Yeah.
It's a pretty out there concept.
It's generational change in power is not new to Southeast Asia. This model of it is new in the sense of it's a very much, we see an intra-party negotiated transition. And the number of folks, I think that's where the Cambodia story is going to strike political scientists as worthy of study as a transition model. Because we're not simply talking about Singapore, where we saw essentially, okay, we had Goh Chok Tong, but we all knew what was coming afterwards. I mean, it's the Lee family. So, I mean, that's just one individual and the family's interest.
Opposed to
Here we're seeing, and not an entire cabinet, but quite a few folks, obviously, and interior, defense, et cetera, and the power ministries really are being handed down. I interpret it as sort of as a stabilizing strategy. It signals to quite a few folks that, okay, there's not going to be a big change in relationships. That the relationships you had previously are the relationships that are going to continue. We're not starting when we see the formal opening of Parliament. It is a transition with stability. It is a transition where prior relationships will be maintained, and trust in that. So
right.
it's a technique that's been done, and again, it does not. I can't think of any comparable case where we've had this number of folks. But family staying in power. I mean, we can look at. I mean, Philippine politics is a really great example. And you can look at the Philippine Congress and see how many people have. I mean, you look to Japan, but obviously this is very, very different. We're not talking about a fully that liberal democratic context. We're talking about the Cambodian context and having such change. But for stability and for continuity, it's not a bad idea. And it seems so far, at least, to have dealt with any questions of intra-party dissent.
Which Hun Sen would argue is what his government is.
Stability.
Stability.
Peace and stability. Peace and stability.
And that you get cross-border trade, you get growth.
Yeah, and that's the narrative. I mean, the framing has been about. I mean, the phrase that we see everywhere. I mean, I can go walk out my front door and walk down the street, and there's a large sign that says "Thanks, peace," and that's become the sort of the slogan. And what comes from that? And what comes from that is
we can also see a couple of hundred people who have been arrested, some charged, jailed. Independent media closed down. And
this is going to be as we scroll back, because it's not just the Ream question that will cause problems and is going to continue to cause problems.
It's another negative.
It's exact. I mean, the European Union. I mean, we tend to always think of it in the U.S. context, but the EU as well. I mean, we saw, obviously, the Europeans removed EBA status several years ago. Sweden moved closed its residential embassy here, and they're still open for civil society aid programs.
And the Americans are threatening more sanctions and visa restrictions because of the elections.
So it's that story's not over.
Right. And isn't this where the rub lies? In that for Cambodia to improve its economic prospects, it has to change. But the problem is this change does not look likely despite the generational shift in power.
I concur that change doesn't look likely. That continuity that I've been talking about is, I think, continuity across quite a bit. Although there will be improvements in governance in various areas, the economic focus, et cetera. But we're talking majority-wise a story of continuity. At the same time, I think there's space for a discussion, and I think this discussion that Cambodia needs about its foreign policy or its relationship with the United States, as there's so much genuine incredulity on the Cambodian side, and when you listen to the argument and the critique that's made of the West, saying, well, why do we get so much stick? Look at Vietnam, look at Laos. I mean, they are straight out single party dictatorships, etc.
Sure.
Why does Cambodia get so much stick for being it's status quo? And on a lot of levels, Cambodia is a more open society than our neighbors, Vietnam and Laos. There's the educational institutions, etc. There are still spaces. I mean, Steve Levitsky at Harvard's famous qualification of competitive authoritarianism. Although many have argued that we've now shifted out of that model. But for Cambodia, if you're making a straight comparison, then yeah, there's the Cambodian objection of we're not Vietnam, we're not Laos. Why do we get all of this stuff when these others seem to get a pass? But it also needs to go to the question of why the West, why Washington, etc. Do maintain that narrative to such an extent, and how much the investment in the 1990s, I still see it as a legacy very much of the enormous investment in the 1990s in Cambodian democracy, the enormous investment in state building, enormous investment in nation building, which did not succeed along the lines remotely that was planned at the time. But trying to have a more open discussion of this is for them. Seems at least for one side to be still weighing on the West's approach to Cambodia, but Cambodia being able to have a clear understanding, or at least begin to open up that box of, well, here's why the criticism is coming. It's not just you, but okay, and perhaps a little bit more frank dialogue between the two sides on the topic. It would not hurt. I could see a solid track 2 diplomacy along these lines, which would be very useful.
And on that note, Bradley Murg, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lou. Great to be here.